Thank you all for tuning in. It's the honor of my art historical lifetime to be delivering these Mellon lectures, even and perhaps especially during a pandemic. While I wish I could be delivering these in the glorious National Gallery Auditorium, or indeed any auditorium, I'm actually thankful for the ways in which this year of isolation has taken these lectures in some unexpected directions. It's changed them in content. They'll focus on touch and contact in ways that would have been unimaginable to me just a year ago. And it has changed them in form. With the collapse of so many of my archival research plans over the past year, along with the wider audience that's made possible by this video format, I've come to conceive of this series as being broader and more synthetic in shape than I had originally imagined it to be. My goal in these lectures is to open up new ways of thinking about the significance of print in art history, particularly in terms of modern and contemporary art. As it stands now in the predominant narratives of Western art, printmaking barely registers. It suffers from old prejudices about its marginal secondary status in relationship to media like painting, sculpture, and photography, the media that have really defined the way we understand modern art. And it also suffers from what I think of as a weird form of double invisibility. It's somehow both too obscure and too familiar, both beyond and beneath notice. On the one hand, as a set of processes, printmaking is so technically intricate as to verge on the arcane. From Renaissance etching to contemporary nanoprinting, print processes are complicated and usually non-intuitive. This has tended to push print into hyper-specialized corners of art history that have been difficult to integrate with the rest of the discipline. On the other hand, as a class of art objects, prints tend to be devalued as overly common. They are, in a phrase I hear all the time, just prints. And now that print appears to be vanishing in the digital age, we seem to be letting it go quietly, too quietly, I would say, as if its impending death were just a natural extension of its prior irrelevance. I hope to show that print is very much alive in its deep impact on modern and contemporary art across media, and to argue that printmaking is a much more strange and alien affair than we have been led to believe. In order to make this argument, I'm going to need to take an unorthodox approach to the history and theory of printmaking. First, although I'll often linger on traditional printmaking techniques, I'll focus primarily on contemporary artists that work at the very edge of the medium and beyond. Today's lecture on pressure, for example, will feature printing presses being used to smash ironing boards, fires being set on press beds, and human bodies used as printing plates. Such practices stretch printmaking almost beyond recognition, but in doing so, they allow it to be recognized in a broader field of contemporary ideas and practices, and also allow us to recognize some of the forgotten potentials that print has carried within itself all along. Second, I'll focus relentlessly on the making part of printmaking. I come to this topic from a background in material culture, in studies of craft and making, and in the history of science and technology, not as a traditional print scholar. I'm interested in the unique ways that printmaking generates meaning at the level of fundamental physical operations. So rather than organize these lectures around specific print technologies like etching or screen printing, or around particular artists, or around chronological developments in print history, I'll organize them around a set of basic operations or maneuvers that commonly occur in printmaking. The maneuvers I'll be tracing, one per lecture, are as follows: pressure, reversal, separation, strain, interference, and alienation. Each of these terms is designed to connect materials and movements, the deep textures of printmaking, we might say, with the conceptual possibilities that these forces bring into being. So, for example, pressure is a basic physical force that transfers images in printmaking, but it also opens out onto social cognates like impression or oppression. Each of these terms, like pressure, denotes a specific form of intelligence and a specific area of sensitivity that allows for specific kinds of intervention in social and political life. And each of these terms denotes a maneuver that emerges in printmaking, but is not restricted to it. It can travel to and through other media. And this is how I'll argue that print gets into the full range of modern and contemporary art. Now, you may notice that this list does not include replication. This is a strategic omission on my part. To the extent that printmaking has found a prominent place in art history and other fields in the humanities, it has been studied overwhelmingly for its reproductive function. In 1953, Bill Ivins published Prints and Visual Communication, and this is still the primary text for an overview theory of printed images. Ivins saw the ultimate significance of print as its production of what he called exactly repeatable pictorial statements. In his writings and others that shared his approach, print is taken to be fundamentally about replication, dissemination, and the visual public sphere that this does or does not create. Now, I'm a big fan of Bill Ivins, but I'll be bracketing out this question of reproduction in the weeks ahead. Let me reassure you that I'm not going to get on here every week and argue that printmaking has nothing to do with reproduction. Of course not. But it doesn't have everything to do with reproduction either. Some print processes are not about replication at all, but rather chance and variability. Indeed, you could spend your entire life making prints without ever making a copy of anything. And although theories of reproduction have been enormously fertile in art history, a monolithic emphasis on exactly repeatable pictorial statements has left many of the other qualities of print untheorized and unexplored. It's closed down our ability to talk about some of the ways that print can matter most to contemporary life. Now, as I trace out these maneuvers of print, I'll focus broadly on art in the US and Europe after about 1960. This is partially arbitrary, it just happens to be the field in which I'm trained. But it's also a particularly productive place to think about print and to rethink print, because during this time, rich avenues of interchange were developing between print and all of the other arts. Just for example, let's look at 3 pivotal moments in the careers of 3 pivotal artists. In the later 1950s, Jasper Johns began using stencils to produce gridded paintings of numerals and alphabets. In 1960, Robert Rauschenberg completed a series of drawings based on Dante's Divine Comedy that included solvent transfer images. In order to do this, he selected images from magazines, soaked them in lighter fluid, turned them face down, rubbed them with an empty ballpoint pen, and transferred them onto paper in a kind of ghostly reverse. In 1962, Andy Warhol began using screen printing to transfer photographic halftones of movie stars and car crashes onto large canvases. Now, in any canonical narrative of 20th century American art, these are transformative moments. Johns's number grids beget conceptual art, minimalism, and an entire range of systematic painting practices. Rauschenberg's transfers beget various strands of assemblage, intermediation, and performance. Warhol, of course, begets pop and an enormous range of media-based art. But what I think has not been sufficiently recognized is that what these 3 events have in common is that in each case, the artist diverted a printmaking technique into another, more high-status medium, in this case, painting or drawing. Stencils are among the oldest of print technologies. Solvent transfer, moving ink from one surface to another in reverse under pressure, is blatantly a form of printing. And screen printing is, of course, screen printing. Now, at the same moment that this was happening, there were 2 major infusions of energy in the arts around print and print technology in the United States, one from the commercial side and one from the fine art side. New and more efficient commercial print techniques were transforming the visual landscape. The often noted post-war image profusion emerged from the perfection of high-speed offset presses and the development of more effective color printing. This world of efficient commercial printing was becoming increasingly permeable to the fine arts, since so many notable American artists, such as Warhol or Roy Lichtenstein, began their careers as commercial artists. Their job was expressly to translate between fine art media and the language of print. Their job every day was to think about the relationship between print and other forms of art media. Second was the phenomenon known in the US as the print renaissance. This period saw a surge of interest in older traditional techniques like etching, engraving, woodcut, and stone lithography. In rapid succession, several legendary print studios were established to provide equipment, expertise, and training in these processes. Universal Limited Art Editions in Long Island in 1957, Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles in 1960, Crown Point Press in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1962, and many more. And I'll just mention something that should be glaringly obvious about this slide, but which is also worth much further study, namely that the master printers that started all 3 of these major workshops were women. Now, the standard operating model of these studios was to invite well-known artists to spend days or weeks in the workshop with the printers, learning and experimenting with these processes. This became another primary site for the crossover between printmaking and other art media. Artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg spent enormous amounts of time in these environments, learning to make prints and, crucially, learning to think and work like printers and printmakers. And those experiences changed their work in painting and other media in fundamental ways. So let's dive into pressure. I have a few key terms and definitions to introduce at the outset. More technical detail will be trickling into these lectures as we go along week to week. So first, the matrix is the object, the plate or block or screen that bears the image to be transferred. The support is the surface that receives that image, usually but not always a sheet of paper. The ink is the transferred substance itself, although I will add that you can still make a print and impression without ink. And then finally, pressure is the force that makes that transfer possible. The working definition of a print for this lecture series will be as follows. A print is an object that has been made by transferring an image between two surfaces in contact. Every print is the result of a process of contact and release, which links it immediately to themes of touch, presence, and intimacy, but also loss, separation, and memory. Contact is essential to the definition of print, especially as a means for usefully distinguishing it from photography. And there'll be much more talk about this as we go forward in future lectures. Now, of course, photography also involves the replicable transfer of information between surfaces, but the carrier of that transfer in photography is light, which bounces from one surface to another at a distance. Photography does not require mechanical contact or pressure, and print does. Now, this has many further implications. For example, print always happens at actual size, while photography does not. And again, I'll return to these in later lectures. Now, the earliest and most general meanings of the English noun print share this emphasis on direct contact and pressure. The first two definitions listed in the Oxford English Dictionary emphasize the act of impression or indentation, the preservation of a form left by the pressure of an object. Many of the earliest forms of printing, such as seals and stamps, drew their value from this guarantee of contact. This is an ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seal. The matrix is a cylinder of quartz into which a scene has been carved. It's been rolled out onto a modern pliable support on the right, yielding the cylindrical scene as a flat image. Now, seals like this bore authority because of the direct contact required to produce them. If a particular king or official had this seal, then its imprint would authenticate a certain communication as having come from that office. It carried proof of fidelity because of adjacency. It was the record of a contact event. As records of contact events, prints also intersect with the history of contact relics, particularly imagistic relics like the sudarium or Veronica's veil, an iconic motif in Western Christianity since the Middle Ages. According to tradition, when St. Veronica stopped to wipe the blood and sweat from the face of Christ with her veil along the way to Calvary, a miraculous image of the face remained on the cloth thereafter. Now, the authority of this image derives from its direct contact with the face of Christ, so that the transferred image is itself taken to be sacred. Now, it's not surprising that early modern printmakers seized on the sudarium as an emblematic of their own work, which, after all, also involved transferring an image from one surface to another through contact. Here are two Veronicas by two of the most brilliant and self-reflexive artists of the 16th and 17th century, Claude Mellan and Albrecht Dürer. We'll see both of these again later in the series. The sudarium also invoked printmaking through its relationship to wounds and wounding. Like the veil absorbing Christ's thorn-gouged blood, prints were made by cutting and scratching into one body, such as the copper plate shown here, and transferring viscous matter, or ink, from there onto another surface. Most prints are contact relics in this sense, inasmuch as they are essentially stains on one surface that attest to damage done to another surface. Because of their miraculous origins, relics like the sudarium were called acheiropoetic, meaning not made by human hands. This too is a quality that is shared by prints in general. In printmaking, the print itself, in the last analysis, is not made by human hands, but by the press, or by whatever instrument is being used to apply pressure. Now, while I loop this video of a student printing and etching, I want to talk through some of the sensory implications of this non-human mode of image transfer. Although it is not human, the printing press is a sensitive perceptual instrument. After all, it has to sense the image on the matrix in order to print it. It does this by applying pressure to the matrix, which responds to that pressure according to the chemical or topographical qualities of its surface, according to the incisions on a copper plate, for example, or the greasy patterns on a lithographic stone. This is much closer to a tactile mode of perception than a visual one. Indeed, although the printing press is used for the production of visual art, it is not itself an optical instrument. If you want to print a visual image, you must first convert it into something that can be felt. The image must be translated into grooves or ridges, adhesions, viscosities. The printing process is akin to an act of communication with a blind alien. And printmaking is blind in another sense. The moment of printing is radically invisible. The actual formation of the print occurs in a tight, unobservable space. The print is made darkly. What happens there happens between the matrix and the ink and the support. No one can watch it. No one can surveil it. This helps explain the mystique of the pull in printmaking, that moment when the image is peeled away from the matrix, revealing it to the eye and to the air for the first time. Once the print is pulled, it enters the luminal world of the visual arts. It's released into the light, into space, into the range of the aerial and the optical. Now we can back up and get a look at it. But when we do, we should not forget that we're always looking at a recording of an event that occurred beyond the range of looking. We're looking at the fossilized traces of a hidden, sequestered act of material perception. No matter how airy or spatial the illusionary image of the print might be, it is, first of all, a remnant of a blind, anaerobic moment of contact. Usually this is forgotten as the print travels downstream and takes its place among other kinds of more blithely visual images. But contemporary artists have sometimes found ways to more fully acknowledge the conditions under which these images come into being under pressure. John Cage's fire prints, made at Crown Point Press in the 1980s, are a great example. Throughout his work, Cage tried to avoid the imposition of his own artistic will or authority, preferring instead to make decisions based on chance operations and to operate in an attitude of open receptivity rather than control. At Crown Point, he made a series of prints that were thoroughly open to the closed conditions of the press. He would start a small pile of crumpled newspapers on fire, cover it with a damp sheet of paper, let it smolder for a while, and then run the whole conflagration through the press. The prints that result from this are extinguishments. The suffocating pressure and blindness of the press becomes the work itself. The image is literally composed by putting out the fire, putting out the light. Pressure is not an accessory here to the creation of some other independent image. Pressure creates the image in total. Note that these prints, though born of destruction, also have a quality of delicacy and sensitivity to them. This paradoxical co-presence of pressure and delicacy will be a continuing refrain for the rest of this lecture. Robert Rauschenberg also brought out the generative qualities of pressure in the printing process. In the fall of 1974, he worked with the experimental Los Angeles print workshop Gemini GEL on a series of works known as the Hoarfrost editions. This was a group of prints made on multi-layered fabric that emphasized fugitive, fragmentary imagery and veiling effects. They were made by spreading out fabric on the bed of a lithography press, then topping the fabric with pages torn from newspapers and magazines, some flat, some folded, some wrinkled or balled up. Rauschenberg frequently nestled empty paper bags, sometimes flat and sometimes folded, into these layers. Often there would be multiple layers of fabric and paper balancing on the bed in what I can only think to call a print sandwich. At various points in the construction of this sandwich, the newspapers and printed matter would be sprayed with chemical solvents that would solubilize the ink so that it could be released onto the fabric. The paper bags, printed papers, fabrics, adhesives, and solvents then went through the press multiple times at pressures ranging from 600 to 1,000 pounds per square inch. Before going under the pressure bar, the collection of material was often as much as 5 inches thick. Afterwards, it was compressed to less than a centimeter. When the sandwich was peeled apart and only fabric and paper bags remained, the transferred ink from the newspapers announced unequivocally that this was, we might say, a pressure-cooked image. The images are not just replicated by pressure, but fully composed by it. As the press crumpled and crushed the printed matter, it made a new print that disrupted the original images and rewrote the text, clearly announcing the creative and disruptive role of pressure in the work. The paper bags are also reshaped by pressure as they're flattened into their interleaving forms. Now, through these flattened paper volumes, Rauschenberg is actually asking a series of questions about what it might mean to understand pressure as a means of dimensional translation, and thus as a mode of pictorial representation. One of the main problems to be worked out in pictorial art is, how do you get three-dimensional objects onto a two-dimensional surface? The prevailing solution, of course, is illusionism, perspective, shading, etc. This, for example, is how Da Vinci gets a human head onto a flat plane in this drawing. But another solution, as Rauschenberg implicitly points out here, is literal. You do it by essentially running over the object, smashing it down from a volume to a plane. Now, there was a lot of talk of modernist flatness in post-war American art theory, more than I can possibly review here. But suffice it to say that this smashed paper bag gives us a version of modernist flatness that goes well beyond the prevailing imagination of the period. Modernist flatness as a concept was almost entirely based on painting. Rauschenberg hints here at a more forceful model that might emerge if printing were instead the medium driving art theory and criticism. The period account of modernist flatness that came closest to the raw reality of this pressed bag was the so-called flatbed picture plane theorized by Leo Steinberg, who had in fact been inspired by Rauschenberg's earlier work. Steinberg argued that the orientation and function of the picture plane had undergone a radical shift at around mid-century. Painters were no longer thinking of the picture plane as a vertical window corresponding to an experience of observing the world upright, but rather as a horizontal, flat, table-like surface upon which information could settle and be infinitely reconfigured. But although Steinberg had referred directly to the printing press in his use of the term flatbed, his model was really more table-like, imagining images and objects sitting passively on a surface. Rauschenberg instead takes truly printerly levels of force and pressure to be templates for the picture plane. What kind of picture plane, then, is a picture plane under pressure? Just to give one example, the reforming of matter in the press produces a model of the picture plane in which force emerges bidirectionally from both above and below. In printmaking, it's not only the application of pressure from above that creates the impression, it's also and equally the necessary grounding resistance of the print bed from below, offering an equal and opposite reaction. You need both pressure from above and counter pressure from below in order to make a print. Every act of printing is simultaneously a pressing down and a pressing up. Both pressure and, crucially, the resistance to it live in every print. So an object that occupies this kind of pictorial space is charged with these counterforces in ways that far exceed the standard painterly model of flatness. It is an object that pushes back. There are other forms of what I would call extreme printing that capture this dynamic of an unruly image force emerging from below or behind the picture plane. Consider the rubbing. These are rubbings made by contemporary artist Jennifer Bornstein. They're part of a complex project in which she made rubbings of her deceased father's belongings. For this print, for example, she covered a pair of khakis with a sheet of paper and used a blue wax crayon to rub the image through. The image is strange and haunting, particularly in the way the clothing appears to become partly transparent under the pressure of the rubbing tool. It's as if we're seeing through the top pant leg to the bottom pant leg, and this is because Bornstein's application of pressure to the paper also automatically picks up counterpressure from beneath, essentially seeing through the object by rubbing it. If the resulting image is visually nonsensical and slightly otherworldly, it's because rubbing, like all printing, shows us the world as seen by touch and only later given over to the eye. Bornstein's rubbings pick up on the history of surrealist rubbings and frottage, but they recall even more directly the history of monument and gravestone rubbing. This is from a famous series of New England gravestone rubbings published in 1963 by Anne Parker and Avon Neal. It shows a resurrection scene with an angel hovering over a tomb, sounding a call for the dead to rise. Now, the act of making a gravestone rubbing is itself eerily like a form of resurrection, because as you rub the paper, the image appears before you as if lifted through the paper from the stone below. This contact image, made through pressure, somehow combines extreme tactility with a sense of phantom-like emergence. Now, we've seen so far that printing generates not just multiple images, but multiple models of the image in its deployment of contact and pressure. These range from the revelatory or redemptive model that we've seen from the conversion between touch and vision, to the forceful model that is shot through with echoes of both violence and resistance. Why does this matter beyond the print studio? What does this range of sensitivity and expression born out of printerly pressure make possible? For the remainder of this lecture, I want to explore these questions through the work of two African-American contemporary artists, Willie Cole and David Hammons. Both Cole and Hammons have dexterously harnessed the printerly language of pressure in order to negotiate the special challenges of representing the Black body in a visual field that is always already structured by racism and racial violence. As Saidiya Hartman has asked, how does one give expression to the outrages of Black bodily pain and suffering without presenting it as a spectacle, without reenacting subjection, without submitting that body to repeated visual objectification? Cole and Hammons show how the language of pressure in print, with its tactile subtlety and sensitivity, its tolerance of contradiction and ambiguity, and its uncertain relationship to visuality, can uniquely intervene in these questions. And I want to add that although Cole and Hammons are coming at the end of this lecture, their work has really informed it from the start. Much of what I have learned about pressure in print, I have learned from them. Willie Cole's Beauties is a series of 28 prints made from stripped, hammered, flattened, inked, and printed ironing boards. Each print bears a woman's name from the generation of Cole's grandmothers. In multiple generations in his family, the women worked as housekeepers. Cole remembers that as he was growing up, they would often ask him to fix their steam irons. The whole series is a testament to the invisible labor of Black women in America. Each print is also a meta-print about pressure. The very process of making them with a press reiterates the acts of pressing from which they ultimately derive as ironing boards. And they're not only about pressure, but all its cognates: oppression, compression, impression. For more than 30 years, Cole has been using irons and ironing boards as both tools and motifs, evoking the history of slavery and racist oppression in America. He's known for his steam iron scorch prints, which clearly evoke the practice of branding. He's also explored the resemblance between the ironing board and the iconic diagram of the slave ship. The Beauties carry all of these associations forward in Cole's work, but they're not simply records of brutality. They do recall slave ships as well as branding, but also full-length aristocratic portraits, African shields, X-rays, Gothic windows, and more. They have this associational complexity because Cole has engaged with the full range of associations that printerly pressure can bring forth. The Beauties were made at the High Point Center for Printmaking in Minneapolis, where Cole had a residency in 2011 and 12. Cole and the printers at High Point took a set of vintage ironing boards, removed the covers, and flattened them, first with hammers and sledges in the parking lot, creating a series of strike marks and scratches on the surface of the steel boards. The boards were then run through the press between sheets of masonite, so that each was reduced to about 4 to 5 millimeters thick. With its pattern of depressions and incisions, each ironing board was then a matrix that could be inked and printed in essentially the same way that a copperplate engraving or etching plate would be handled in a traditional print shop. The resulting prints embody the model of the image as a contact relic, and particularly as a wound image. There is a sacrificial quality that pervades every mark on the prints. The hammering, dragging, gouging, and crumpling of the original ironing boards produces physical evidence of violence that transfers directly to each print. So one thing Cole's work does is that it seizes this medieval model of the sacrificial wound image and extends it to African American women's history, fusing the sanctity of the wounded saint with that of the victim of racial or gendered violence. But it goes beyond this. As we've seen, applying pressure to a matrix transmits information about texture and topography that is not available to the eye, thus performing an act of revelation or even transparency. This paradox is exemplified by the beauties. Take this one, titled Dot, for example. Standing in front of it, you know that you're looking at an imprint taken from just one side, the top of the board, which is a solid sheet of steel. Yet you're also given the inescapable illusion of being able to see through it, as if it were made of translucent material somehow. It looks like an X-ray, or again, a stained glass window. You can clearly perceive the pattern of struts and supports that occupy the other side of the board, 2 strong vertical lines and 2 horizontals, each darkening against the pattern of the facing front surface. How is this possible? It's because the printing press senses variation in the thickness of the boards. In this case, it reads those struts on the back because the board is thicker in those areas. Here's the print titled Queen and the board from which it was printed. The print Queen reveals much more to the eye. It lets us see the other side of the board than does the board or the matrix itself. The print is so full of exquisite incidental detail that it resembles a Rembrandt etching with its wide variation in sharpness, tone, and the scale of marks. And it clearly indicates, again, these 3 horizontal struts behind the board, whereas the matrix or the board itself is much more reticent visually in comparison. So the press, we might say, sees the topographical incidence of the ironing board far better than does the human eye. Like a tactile X-ray, it diagnoses internal wounds or injuries, perhaps, hidden to the naked eye. The press thus bears a strong forensic power in its ability to manifest or make visible the insignificant or the invisible. Whether we think of the skeletal underside of the board or the tiniest scratches and insults to its surface that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, it exposes what is hidden. There's a truth-telling quality about printing. No wonder the first prints pulled from a plate are called proofs. Considering that these prints are about revealing the overlooked in so many ways, Cole could not have chosen a more powerful medium of perception, memory, transfer, and testimony. But this is not just an act of forensic exposure. The prints back up this transparency with forces of resistance and creative agency born from pressure. Consider the dignity inherent in the vertical posture of the prints as they're hung on the wall. The prints, in fact, strongly recall full-length aristocratic portraiture in the West. The print named Queen, for example, standing tall with its flaring, folding contour, recalls any number of other queens in the history of aristocratic representation. If these had simply been paintings, their upright posture would have been uncomplicated, tensionless. After all, full-length portrait paintings are made vertically in the first place. But here, the uprightness of the figures is all the more significant because we know they have risen up, pivoted from a horizontal scene of making governed by pressure. This emphasizes the endurance, resistance, and precarity behind their standing rather than any easy sense of self-possession. The beauties don't just stand, we might say, they withstand. This awareness is available even for a viewer that is not aware of the details of the fine art printing process, because presumably all viewers are aware of the horizontal posture of ironing boards and the scenes of pressure that accompany the act of ironing itself. Now, about that essential connection between printmaking and ironing. By attending to pressure as a fundamental determinant of print, we're able to see connections between Cole's work and the work of his grandmothers that might not otherwise have been available to us. Ironing resembles printmaking in many ways, and these prints help us to see that both practices encourage unique forms of perception, sensitivity, and intelligence. To give just one example, ironing and printmaking both generate unorthodox forms of cognition and critical insight about bodies in space. Ironing the sleeve of a shirt, for example, is an act of multidimensional perception. Seams and buttons on the back of the sleeve emboss the front as the 2 layers merge under the heat and pressure. Just as the printing press can generate transparency from pressure, the ironer also sees through these front and back layers with the iron. Cole and his grandmothers, then, are linked by a direct legacy of pressure and perception. By harnessing pressure as a creative force, Cole makes visible the labor of Black domestic servants in a way that fully acknowledges their oppression, but also acknowledges and passes along their artistry. Now, before moving on to the work of David Hammons, I want to add a few technical notes about pressure in the printing process. Most of the pressure I've discussed so far has been high pressure, the crushing, flattening pressure of these structurally massive printing presses. And just to give you some rough numbers here, to print a sheet of type on a common or platen press, you need about 175 pounds per square inch, multiplied over the entire area to be printed. To print an etching or an engraving of about the same size on a roller press requires about 1,500 psi, multiplied over the length of the cylinder roller. Lithography presses require about 800 to 1,000 pounds per square inch. This, by the way, is the kind of press that Rauschenberg used for the hoarfrosts. And by the way, if you've ever wondered why lithography stones are so thick and massive, it's because they need to be able to withstand this enormous pressure of the press. In fact, it's quite easy to break a stone. One of Rauschenberg's most famous prints is called Accident. The stone broke in the press while he was making it, and he decided to cobble the stone back together and print it as broken, including the chips that had come off. And then there are hydraulic presses, like the one at Two Palms Press in New York, which produced the intense deformation that you see in this detail of a print by Mel Bachner. Craig Zamiello, the master printer at Two Palms, tells me that they usually run this press at 300 to 400 tons per square inch. That's 800,000 pounds per square inch. Now, all that said, there's also printing that lies on the other end of the pressure spectrum. Many of the more recent printing technologies use rubber elements to transfer ink more softly. There's the squeegee in screen printing. In offset lithography, the most common method of printing images today, a rubber roller called a blanket roller picks up the ink from the plate, moves it over to the paper, and rolls it out to deposit it there. The action of the blanket roller's pressure is referred to as a kiss. And in fact, several types of very light impressions taken softly are called kiss impressions in printing lingo. Or think of marbling, which is also, perhaps surprisingly, a form of printing. In paper marbling, a tray is filled with a mucilaginous substance or water treated with surfactants, and inks are floated and then manipulated on that surface. The image is then transferred by gently laying a sheet of paper on the surface and carefully lifting it away. This is a limit case of delicacy in printmaking. The matrix here is just the surface of the liquid held together by surface tension. The pressure is provided by simple gravity on the paper meeting that surface. Now, marbling may seem quaint and old-fashioned, but many of the most advanced printing technologies today are actually closer to marbling than they are to something like copperplate engraving. They work by exploiting the very fine, often nanoscale behavior of fluid inks and surface tension. The future of printing is based on the physics of bubbles and droplets and their own responses to tension and pressure. So this is all very light pressure, but it is still pressure, and it reminds us that the contact inherent in printing can link up materially and metaphorically with a huge range of associations of the senses. Print can perform gentleness and intimacy, as well as violence or stress. In the late 1960s and early 1970s in Los Angeles, the artist David Hammons made a series of body prints that show how this full range of sensory contact can operate within the racial politics of representation. To make a print like this, Hammons would first cover himself, including his clothing, with a greasy or oily substance, usually margarine, and press himself against a piece of blank paper or board on the floor. He would then sift powdered pigment onto the clear, oily impression, letting it fall like a dust cloud onto the latent image below. These prints come across as records of an impact event between body and surface, and many of them not only suggest, but even reenact, racial violence. In order to make these prints, Hammons had to press his body onto the paper in awkward contortions, essentially assuming a series of stress positions on the ground or sometimes against the wall. Imagine putting your own body in the positions necessary to make these impressions, and the traumatic connotations of this performance of pressure become unmistakable, not to mention horrifically familiar from countless scenes of police brutality. Printing, pressure, and pressing here are equated with blunt oppression. Now, within this context, Hammonds might seem to be reducing his own body to an object of brutality, just another hypervisible trace of racist violence. But as art historian Kelly Jones has pointed out, the gift of these works, as she says, is that the element of violence is seen not as an immobilizing force, but as one in which Black language can intervene. How does this intervention actually work in Hammonds' language of pressure and print? How can these prints mobilize the Black body in representation through pressure? Now, there are in fact multiple modes of agency at work in these images. First of all, built into the process of Hammonds' self-pressing is a model of internally conscious representation, a model of the self-possessed image. In a 1971 interview, Hammonds spoke about a key technical challenge in his work, namely, how to get up from the paper again. Here's what he has to say. When I lie down on the paper which is first placed on the floor, I have to carefully decide how to get up after I have made the impression that I want. Sometimes I lie there for perhaps 3 minutes or even longer, just figuring out how I can get off the paper without smudging the image that I'm trying to print. This is a remarkable statement. It means that his postures, while acknowledging a certain traumatic immobilization, are also about strategic, even artful subjectivity. When we look at Hammonds' body prints, we are looking at the trace of a figure that was thinking about being a figure at the moment of figuring itself, thinking about how to make the transition in and out of a state of representation. Out is the key word here. The key point here is that Hammonds does get up again. In fact, the print is only possible because of this successful act of pulling oneself up. We've already seen that print requires both contact and release, both press and pull, and these works ensure that a certain release and even redemption are inherent to the very act of representation. In most of his body prints, Hammonds would repeat this process of press and release multiple times, responding to previous impressions with new impressions, either by himself or with others. He builds up the prints according to a sequential logic of returning to the body. There's a kind of self-sedimentation at work here in both time and space. In this untitled body print from the Harvard Art Museum's collection, we see the evidence of multiple different impressions, at least 3, that have been dusted in several different colors. One impression is a profile, arms folded in a defiant position, but there's also a face impressed frontally and a frontal torso. There are at least 2 different shirts, one a button-down and one a knit sweater, and 2 different pairs of pants. If these prints acknowledge the impact of violence, then, they also embody a practice of care for the victimized body, a practice based explicitly on touch and intimacy. Hammonds returns to each impression as he would to another body, laying his head on its chest, laying his cheek on its cheek, wrapping his hand around its waist, bringing eyelash to eyelash. We might say that Hammonds' body rolls over, even mourns over, previous bodily traces. This is an inherently careful and gentle operation, because he needed not to disturb or destroy the previous impressions with the new ones. The delicacy and sensitivity of this operation cannot be overemphasized. This is not the record of a blunt impact. These are prints made by the softest, most sensitive parts of the body, prints made by lips, hair, eyelashes, even the tiny reticulations of the surface of the skin, those finest networks of corporeal sensitivity. Making these prints must have required a remarkable blend of strength and gentleness. Hammonds had to press himself to the paper, but only lightly, resisting the pull of gravity in order to capture a coherent imprint of these tenuous structures. Note that in doing so, Hammonds offers a gentle and thus all the more powerful rebuke to the history of racist ideas about the Black body as being without fine sensation. The hair is especially important here. It races through the print like a fine electrical discharge, a system of precarious but powerful energy. Hammonds insists on this delicacy as the last word, the last impression of the print. Here, notice that a flurry of body hair appears to sit on the outside of a corduroy pant leg, a strange reshuffling of bodily integuments, an inversion of boundary layers. As in so many of the other rubbings and impressions we have seen today that create images of internal revelation, Hammonds' prints use the subtleties and sensitivities of printerly pressure to create a new model of subtle and sensitive Black representation. That's it for today and for Pressure. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, we will have Reversal.